my people, did you hear what just happened? The US has banned visas for Burkina Faso, all because the West African nation said no to a US deportation.
Power is never lost, it's only redefined. When the US Embassy in Ouagadougou suspended all visa services, it wasn't paperwork, it was punishment. Burkina Faso had refused to play America's immigration game, rejecting Washington's demand to host deportees expelled under Trump's crackdown. Within hours, the embassy lights went dim, and a new kind of diplomacy was born, the diplomacy of defiance. This isn't just a visa freeze, it's the end of obedience. And how far will this go? Let's find out. The morning of October 10th, 2025, began like any other in Ouagadougou, sun-baked streets, motorbikes humming past the U.S. Embassy's high walls, and a line of visa applicants waiting with their documents clutched in folders. Then, without warning, the embassy's notice board changed. A single paragraph appeared on the screen. All routine visa services are suspended until further notice. No context, no apology. Just silence from the country that never misses a chance to preach transparency. Within an hour, the queue dissolved. By noon, the story had consumed the city. People first assumed it was a system outage, but diplomats don't act without reason, and soon the reason surfaced. Burkina Faso had rejected a U.S. proposal to accept deportees expelled under President Donald Trump's intensified immigration purge. In Washington's language, the request was a humanitarian relocation initiative. In Ouagadougou's eyes, it was a demand to turn sovereign soil into a dumping ground for people America no longer wanted. Foreign Minister Karamoko Jean-Marie Traoré went on national television that same evening. Calm, measured. His voice carried the kind of weight that can only come from moral clarity. Burkina Faso is not a land of deportation, he said. Our hospitality is not an excuse for others to offload their problems. The statement landed like thunder. It wasn't anti-American, it was pro-dignity. Inside the embassy, phones started ringing. Reporters asked if the closure was linked to Traoré's declaration. Officials gave the kind of non-answers bureaucracies use when the truth is too revealing. Technical adjustments, they said. But everyone who understands geopolitics knew better. Embassies don't shut down over paperwork, they shut down over pride. For the Burkinabe public, the freeze was more than an inconvenience. It was a revelation. For decades, visas had symbolized opportunity, proof that merit could transcend borders. Yet in one morning, that illusion was shattered. The sudden halt exposed how fragile access becomes when another nation holds the key. It made people ask the question most governments avoid. If a foreign embassy can close its doors overnight, how much of our mobility is truly ours? The timing couldn't have been sharper. Under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso has pursued a doctrine of self-reliance unseen in its post-colonial history, reclaiming gold mines, rewriting contracts, and cutting the strings of dependency one by one. In that context, Washington's proposal looked less like diplomacy and more like disrespect. A superpower asking a sovereign nation to carry its moral waste. The refusal, therefore, wasn't a gesture, it was a declaration of hierarchy reversed. It told the world that the old pattern, the West demanding, Africa complying, had expired, and the embassy's retaliation, whether deliberate or not, only reinforced what Ouagadougou was proving. When you stand upright, expect someone used to your silence to flinch. Ordinary citizens saw symbolism everywhere. The embassy's gates, once open to the select few with paperwork and hope, now stood closed like a monument to inequality. Yet rather than despair, there was an undercurrent of pride. If they don't want us, that's fine, a university student told local radio. It means we're finally too independent to please them. That sentiment captures why this story matters beyond one city. The visa freeze isn't merely a diplomatic chill, it's a psychological shift. It forces both nations to confront what they've become. One addicted to control, the other addicted to survival, and only one of them is evolving. So the question now is no longer why Washington shut its doors. The question is why it made the offer in the first place. What logic drives a global power to ask a proud African nation to absorb its rejected souls? To understand why Washington made such an indecent request, you have to understand what deportation really means in modern American politics. It's no longer about immigration law or border management, it's about projection. When a superpower starts exporting its problems, it's not maintaining order, it's exploiting chaos dressed as policy. Under Donald Trump's renewed presidency, deportation has become the theater of strength, a performance staged for domestic consumption. Every flight of deportees serves as a political advertisement. America is tough again. It tells angry voters that their frustrations have been packaged, labeled, and shipped away. But where do those human packages go when the home country refuses to take them? That's where Washington's strategy mutates from enforcement to diplomacy, or more precisely, to coercion disguised cooperation. Behind closed doors, the U.S. approaches smaller nations with what sounds like a partnership, but feels like pressure. Take our deportees, and in return, receive support, a vague term that could mean aid, training, or simply fewer visa restrictions. The message is never explicit, yet unmistakable. Help us clean our image, and we'll help you polish yours. This is what Burkina Faso refused. Not a humanitarian deal, but a transaction that erases dignity on both sides. To accept it would have meant accepting a label, a country available for hire. And once that label sticks, it doesn't come off easily. Haiti knows it. Honduras knows it. Nations that once agreed to temporary deportation arrangements found themselves years later still hosting those temporaries, with no funding and no exit plan. The philosophical crime in this system isn't only moral hypocrisy, it's intellectual deceit. Washington frames deportation as a question of responsibility, claiming that developing nations must do their part. But it's worth asking, who created the global system that drove migration in the first place? Who shaped the economic policies, resource extraction, and security crises that displaced millions? The same powers now claim innocence behind their borders. This is why Burkina Faso's rejection cuts so deep. It unmasks the entire narrative. When Traoré said, "We are not a land of deportation," he wasn't speaking only for Burkina Faso. He was challenging the idea that Africa must perpetually absorb the consequences of Western failure. His words inverted the lens. If Africa didn't cause the problem, why should Africa carry its burden? And that is precisely what makes the U.S. response so revealing. The embassy closure wasn't just diplomatic sulking, it was a shock. Washington is used to compliance, not conscience. When a nation that was once peripheral says no, the entire architecture of hierarchy trembles. The power imbalance that allowed the West to outsource its guilt suddenly looks fragile. At its core, deportation diplomacy thrives on an old assumption that desperation makes nations docile. But that assumption no longer holds. Burkina Faso, like much of Africa today, is redefining what desperation even means. Poverty may limit resources, but it doesn't limit reasoning. A nation that has already survived war, sanctions, and isolation cannot be threatened by paperwork. And here lies the pivot point in this story. Because once deportation fails as leverage, the next logical step for Washington is to reach for subtler tools. Economic pressure, visa freezes, media narratives, ways to discipline without admitting defeat. So the question moves forward. If deportation is the hard power of control, what happens when America turns to soft power, the weapon that looks polite but wounds deeper? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. If deportation is the blunt instrument of control, the visa is the velvet rope, soft to the touch, yet harder to break. Once the threat of forced removal fails, Washington doesn't shout, it whispers. It doesn't send soldiers, it sends silence. And that silence comes stamped in a blue passport. To most people, a visa looks harmless, a printed sticker granting permission to move. But in geopolitics, it's a form of behavioral management. The logic is simple. Whoever controls mobility controls imagination. If you can decide who studies abroad, who gets scholarships, and who travels for trade, you can sculpt the next generation's loyalty without firing a single shot. That is why embassies matter, not just as buildings, but as factories of aspiration. When the U.S. Embassy in Ouagadougou suspended visas, it wasn't punishing the government directly. It was targeting the social class most likely to dream beyond borders. The message was psychological, not bureaucratic. Your defiance has a cost, and we can measure it in isolation. For the farmer in Kaya or the trader in Bobo Dioulasso, life continued unchanged. But for the student with a scholarship offer, the entrepreneur waiting for a conference in Atlanta, the artist scheduled to exhibit in New York, the door closed quietly, like opportunity itself had a foreign landlord. And this is how soft power works. through selectivity. It creates a hierarchy of privilege within nations, teaching citizens that dignity is negotiable if ambition depends on foreign permission. Those who comply are rewarded with access. Those who resist are left outside the gates. The tactic is elegant because it doesn't need force, it needs desire. But here's the miscalculation. Desire changes direction faster than policy. The same Africa that once gazed toward the West for validation is now gazing sideways, to Asia, the Middle East, and within itself. The closing of one embassy opens 10 new possibilities. China offers full scholarships without political sermons. Russia trains engineers without preaching democracy. Turkey, India, and Egypt host trade expos where African entrepreneurs are guests, not subjects. The moment Washington weaponized its visa, it also devalued it. The monopoly on aspiration ended. There's a deeper irony here. The United States built its identity on the idea of mobility, a land of immigrants, opportunity, and movement. Yet today, it uses immobility as punishment. That contradiction doesn't weaken Burkina Faso. It weakens the myth of America itself. You can't preach freedom of movement and then close your gates when others move in directions you dislike. Still, this shift forces Africa into a philosophical confrontation with itself. If movement is restricted, will the continent finally invest in making staying home worthwhile? For years, visa queues symbolized success. Now they symbolize dependence. Maybe the suspension, unintentionally, is pushing a new kind of pride. If they won't let us in, we'll build what they come to see. Yet the embassy freeze was not the end of the story. It was the prelude. Because once visas lose their leverage, the global equation changes completely. Nations start asking questions they were never meant to ask. Why must approval come from outside? Why should progress require permission? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. When a continent stops asking for entry and begins defining the terms of engagement, diplomacy changes shape. The suspension of visas in Ouagadougou didn't isolate Africa, it clarified Africa. For years, Western powers assumed that closing doors would weaken the continent. Instead, it exposed how many other doors had quietly been built elsewhere. That moment marked the birth of a new diplomatic language: reciprocity. The word sounds simple, but its meaning is revolutionary. You treat us as we treat you. No more hidden hierarchies, no more special conditions. If America can deny visas, Mali can impose a $10,000 bond. If Europe can sanction, Niger can nationalize. If the West can choose partners, Africa can choose principles. This is not revenge, it's rebalancing. Across the Sahel, a new coalition is proving it. The Alliance of Sahel States AES, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger now functions as the intellectual center of a continental awakening. These nations, once labeled fragile, are setting the precedent for independent security, trade, and diplomacy. They've learned that sovereignty isn't just about controlling territory, it's about controlling narrative. And narrative is power. What's striking is how this shift began with rejection, not acquisition. Mali's visa bond was mocked at first. Western analysts called it symbolic retaliation. But symbols are how civilizations announce change. Within months, the policy transformed into a continental conversation about equality. If visas can have a price, then dignity can too. And for the first time, the West realized Africa could send invoices. In parallel, Burkina Faso's decision to lift visa fees for all African nations turned its capital into a crossroads of solidarity. Traders from Senegal, Ghana, and Benin entered freely. Flights increased, and the message was unmistakable. The future of African travel lies within Africa. The same week Washington closed its doors, Ouagadougou opened its borders. That contrast wasn't coincidental, it was philosophical. What makes this era different is the tone. Past African diplomacy was apologetic, always justifying its choices to donors or creditors. The new generation of leaders, from Ibrahim Traoré to Assimi Goïta, speaks without explanation. They don't frame independence as rebellion, they frame dependency as regression. Their diplomacy is built on symmetry: partnership with Moscow, cooperation with Beijing, trade with Ankara, not as substitutes for the West, but as correctives to imbalance. Even the institutions that once defined development are being quietly replaced. Instead of waiting for IMF loans, nations are forming sovereign wealth funds, trading minerals for infrastructure, and turning resource wealth into equity rather than debt. That's the quiet revolution the visa freeze accidentally accelerated, a recognition that being shut out can inspire self-reliance faster than being let in ever did. This wave of reciprocity has also transformed African identity abroad. A decade ago, diplomatic protests ended in silence. Today, when the US shuts a consulate, African citizens demand their governments respond in kind. When Western media labels leaders authoritarian, Africans question who gave the labelers authority in the first place. The imbalance of language, not just policy, is being corrected in real time. But reciprocity is not the destination, it's the transition. It teaches power, but it also demands wisdom. Saying no is easy. Defining what yes looks like is harder. The next challenge for Africa isn't resistance, it's construction. If the old order is fading, what kind of global system replaces it? Every act of rebellion must eventually mature into architecture. A nation can reject a deal, expel a power, or close a base, but what comes next defines whether that resistance was survival or strategy. Burkina Faso's story, until now, has been one of defiance. Its next chapter is about design. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré and his government refused America's deportation proposal, they weren't just saying no to humiliation, they were saying yes to self-definition. To reject is to clear space, and now that space demands construction. The question is no longer whether Africa can resist Western pressure. The question is whether it can build a political model that renders such pressure irrelevant. That blueprint is slowly taking shape. Burkina Faso's economic strategy now ties sovereignty to productivity, refining its own gold instead of exporting raw ore, developing local rice industries through and investing in food processing plants rather than waiting for food aid. Each of these steps transforms independence from rhetoric into infrastructure. Diplomatically, the shift is even deeper. Instead of acting as a satellite orbiting foreign capitals, Ouagadougou is positioning itself as a gravitational center in West Africa, where policy radiates outward rather than inward. And this represents something more profound than political change. It represents civilizational renewal. The colonial century taught Africa to measure progress by how closely it mirrored Europe. The post-colonial decades taught it to measure progress by donor approval. Now, the new generation of African states, Burkina Faso at the forefront, is measuring progress by coherence, whether policy aligns with purpose and whether dignity survives success. That shift in measurement is revolutionary because it redefines what leadership means. In the Western tradition, power is the ability to command. In the African Renaissance now unfolding, power is the ability to protect a balance between sovereignty and solidarity, between security and humanity. That is why Traoré's phrase, "We are not a land of deportation," has echoed across the continent not as a slogan but as a principle. It tells Africans that dignity is no longer a moral luxury. It is political currency. Once a country possesses it, loans, sanctions, and summits lose their leverage. But dignity alone is not enough. It must evolve into systems that can sustain it. Burkina Faso's decision to remove visa fees for all Africans, to invest in regional trade corridors, and to promote military self-reliance through the alliance of Sahel states is how defiance becomes doctrine. These are not protests against the world, they are prototypes for a new one. For the first time in generations, Africa is beginning to write global rules instead of following them. Rules that define partnership by fairness, migration by consent, and cooperation by mutual growth. Still, this transformation carries a warning. Every movement that breaks chains must guard against forging new ones. As Africa rises in unity with Russia, China, and others, it must remember that dependence wears many flags. True sovereignty isn't about who helps you, but about who cannot own you. Burkina Faso's challenge, and its chance, is to stay independent even among friends. In that balance lies the meaning of this entire episode. The visa freeze, the deportation standoff, the defiant speeches, they all point to one philosophical truth. Freedom is not achieved by fighting for entry, but by becoming a destination. And that, ultimately, is what Burkina Faso has begun to build. Not just a nation, but an example. A place where refusal becomes respect, where resistance becomes order, and where Africa finally learns the oldest lesson of power. You are not truly free when others stop controlling you. You are free when they start needing you. Do you think Africa's refusal to obey Western pressure marks the beginning of a new global balance? Let us know in the comment section. Should more African nations follow Burkina Faso's example and say no when dignity is on the line? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.